My name is Diana. A lot of you already know me. I am the community manager at the Canadian Psychedelic Association. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you for having us. And I'd like to take a couple minutes here to introduce myself and introduce the Canadian Psychedelic Association if this is your first time with us. We are a community of, I like to think of us as educators. We educate and advocate for psychedelic medicines in Canada as a basic human right. And so we're welcoming you to our community. If you haven't already joined our community, I'd like to invite you to support our work by signing up for a membership. It's only $100 a year. You get a lot of value from it, and we get to do 2 educational webinars and networking events every month where you can learn more about psychedelic medicines, and while you're learning, you are supporting our work to advocate for psychedelic medicines in Canada. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to your host, Dr. Pamela Crisco. She's a board member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. She's a family doctor, a psychedelic researcher, and an amazing human being. So without further ado, Dr. Pam Crisco, please take it away.
Thanks, Deanna. That's very generous of you. It's my honor to be here. I'm one of the founding board members of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. And I echo what Deanna said. Please join. Your membership means a lot to us, and thank you to the hundreds of volunteers that have given some time over the last few years with us. I also want to acknowledge that I come to you today from the unceded territory of the Klahoose First Nations. It is my honor to be here at their discretion. We'll get this going. I am quite excited. I love this topic. I love things that are new. I love it when we get to talk about things that can make this world a better place. And so this topic is quite, I'm quite excited about this, to say the least. So I'll introduce our guest today. So Mark Haden, I hope most of you have had a chance to see Mark before I hear him talk. Mark is currently the Director of Clinical Research at Psygen. He's the Vice President of Business Development at Claremont Medicine. He's an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. He was the director of MAPS Canada for 10 years and did a phenomenal job there. And he's published widely. And our guest interviewer today is Shannon, I'm going to say her name wrong, Smedella. Did I say it right?
That's great.
Oh, thanks. I'm always, don't ever want to mess up people's names. She also was previously at MAPS and got her feet wet in psychedelics there, she tells me, and is the spokesperson for World Psychedelics Day. Keep that on your map. Go to that website and make sure you sign up. You did a fantastic job last time, and I look forward to the next one. And so with that, thank you all for joining, and I'll hand it over to Shannon and Mark.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Pam and Deanna, and the Psychedelic Association, Canadian Psychedelic Association, for having us. And I'm super excited to just have a little chat with you here today, Mark, on this, because every time I get to interview you, I'm just absolutely astonished at the amazing things that you've done in this psychedelic space. You've worked with many different companies. You've been in, the business side of psychedelics, academics, nonprofit, for profit. And, I was wondering, just for the people who don't know your full background today, if you can maybe just start out by giving us a little background and, how have all of these different steps along the way help you to really fulfill your ultimate goal in working with psychedelics? And, what is that ultimate goal really?
Well, thank you, Shannon. In pondering this interview, I was aware that I've worked for government, health authorities, academics, nonprofit and for-profit companies or organizations, and every single one of them offers something in the implementation of the dream to make psychedelics widely available. Governments need to provide regulation, which is important. We need quality psychedelics available, and they also need to change the laws. Academic institutions can do research and educate people. Health authorities will provide the services, and hopefully they will embrace psychedelics into their world. Not-for-profits provide the option of community building and more public education, and for-profits can collect the money to actually do the enormous task of running a clinical trial, which costs millions. So actually, we need all 5 of those organizational structures to implement the vision of wide psychedelic access.
Makes sense, and it's like you said, it's definitely great to have all of those different angles there, and you've seen them all. So we're talking about psychedelics and alcohol use disorder today, and potential treatments. I was wondering if we could start out just by talking about alcohol use disorder. What is alcohol use disorder? What are the complications? How is it harmful? Who does it affect? What are the implications of using alcohol?
Well, alcohol use disorder affects individuals, families, and communities. Quite frankly, one of my more interesting jobs that I had a few years back was training the entire Vancouver Police Department. And one of the questions that I would ask them is, from a policing perspective, what's the most obnoxious drug out there? And by that point in time, I had defined alcohol as being a drug, and they always said alcohol. If somebody's going to take a swing at a cop, it's somebody who's been consuming alcohol. So from a societal point of view, alcohol is, quite frankly, obnoxious. From a family point of view, the police, when they show up to family disputes, it's often somebody who's intoxicated on alcohol, and that causes problems to their family. Individually, if you drink too much of it, you die. That's called acute death. If you drink it for a long period of time, it will also kill you because it causes alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis. And it's curious. I'm a drug educator. I've been educating about drugs for years. And one of the things that drug educators used to say is drugs kill brain cells. The truth of the matter is most drugs don't, but alcohol actually does. Alcohol kills brain cells. If you x-ray an old alcoholic's brain, it's smaller than a normal brain. So alcohol provides significant social, family, and health harms.
It's so interesting, though, that out of all of the drugs, quote unquote, that are out there, it seems to be the most socially acceptable.
Yeah, I know. It's so strange. We've criminalized the wrong drugs.
Yeah. What kind of treatment? So let's say someone's suffering from alcohol use disorder. What is currently out there for treatment?
Well, I worked for 28 years in the addiction services, and so I'm aware that alcohol use disorder has a number of options. One is counseling. If you really want to go and talk to a counselor, it is available. And you have to work on the issues that you want to deal with. And often trauma is a driver of alcoholism, and there are people out there. But quite frankly, a lot of people don't want to do the intensity of that work, and it just doesn't work for them. That level of intimacy and sharing isn't attractive to some people. There's AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a worldwide organization that can be helpful for some people. It's hardcore abstinence, and their actual efficacy, their effect size, their effectiveness is actually quite low for people that show up for the first time. There's also some medicines. There's naltrexone, for example, and a composite that take away some of the pleasure of alcohol. And I have known people in my entire career who have used it successfully, but quite frankly, they're pretty rare. And then there's antabuse, which I don't think anybody ever takes a second time. It'll make you violently ill when you combine it with alcohol. So really, the field of alcoholism treatment is, quite frankly, desperate for help.
So we're going to talk about MEAI today. I was wondering if you can start out just by telling us, what does MEAI stand for? What is MEAI?
Yes. Well, it's one of the amino indanes. So it's a group of molecules that are relatively recent inventions, and they generally feel a bit like MDMA. Somebody described them once as MDMA, which has lost its luster. Stale MDMA is one way of describing that group generally. So 5-methoxy-2-aminoindane is specifically the molecule that we're talking about today, which is MEAI. In terms of the experience of MEAI, the way I describe it is if hopefully at the end of this process that we're involved with, MEAI will be available in a pill. So if you take one pill of MDMA and you swallow it and you wait a little while, it feels like one drink of alcohol, like one beer. If you take a second one, it feels like 2 beers. Now, that's the most I ever drink. So when I've had 2 beers, I'm pretty relaxed and happy and engaged. And that's a really nice level of alcohol. It's a very pleasant experience. It's not massively pleasant. It's just pleasant. If you take another pill, it feels like about 30 milligrams of MDMA. So MDMA is a loving, positive, pink, fuzzy, warm, attractive, connecting kind of molecule. And so it's even more attractive than 2 drinks. Now, it's not 100 milligrams of MDMA. 100 milligrams of MDMA is a normal sort of therapeutic dose. So it's about 30 milligrams. So it's a very mild MDMA experience. If you take another pill, the startling change is actually quite something to experience. And the best way that I've ever described it is you've just finished eating 2 pieces of chocolate-covered goopy cheesecake. And somebody puts a 3rd piece of cheesecake in front of you and hands you a fork. You look at the fork, you look at the cheesecake, and you just go, yuck. You can't imagine touching the fork. So, but you got to think about why. Why don't you want to eat more cheesecake? Because you're not so stimulated, you're hanging off the ceiling. You're not so sedated that you're, sorry, when you work from home, you have to deal with things. The dog just walked in. You're not so sedated that you're unable to walk. You're not violently ill. All of those sort of normal endpoints of substance ingestion aren't why you don't want the cheesecake. You don't want the cheesecake because you're done with cheesecake. You're satiated. You're completely finished. So that's the experience of MEI. So when you add it to alcohol, if you add it at the right dose, some anecdotal evidence has been accumulating. So if somebody is used to drinking 26 ounces of vodka, that's their thing. They really sit down with their bottle of vodka and they want to do what they always do, which is drink 26 ounces. And then you add the right amount of MEI to that, they will like the experience more. It's attractive. They'll like it. But then after about 4 shots of MEI or 4 shots of vodka, depending on the dose of MEI, you just simply stop. You're done. You're finished. You are completely, you just don't drink anymore. It finishes abruptly.
That's super interesting, Mark. So if we, today we're talking about psychedelics and alcohol use disorder, how would you classify MEAI? So, what type of psychedelic is it? Is it a psychedelic?
Well, I have a yes and a no answer to that question. So if you think about psychedelics being like 200 mics of LSD or 5 grams of psilocybin, no, absolutely not. So it's not a spiritual experience. It's not an ego disorienting experience. It doesn't transfer you or transmute you into some other experience. So it's not a classical psychedelic, no. But MDMA and some other molecules that are empathogens are described in the broad category of psychedelics. So because it's like a mild MDMA experience, it does qualify of psychedelic-like. So there was a lot of discussion in Clear Mind Medicine about how to describe it. So the way that they've chosen is a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic, which kind of tries to capture that kind of gray area between something that feels a bit like a psychedelic, but really at the end of the day just helps you to stop drinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to come to the history of MEAI in just a moment here, but what other psychedelics, so if we go back in history, what other psychedelics have been used to treat alcohol use disorder, alcoholism?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of the history happened in Canada, at Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And so they generated about 1,000 research papers. Over 40,000 subjects went through that 15-year period with many different researchers in many countries, but I'm kind of proud of what happened in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, because, hey, I'm a Canadian. But they started out with MDMA. No, wrong, that's not true. They started out with psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD. And they worked their way through 15 years doing lots of research. And what they believed at the time was that alcoholics stopped drinking alcohol because they had DTs, delirium tremens, which are horrible. I used to work in detox. Watching somebody in DTs is very unpleasant. But it's somewhat psychedelic-like because you hallucinate and you see things. So these researchers said, well, hang on a second. If people who get DTs often are so scared by the experience they stop drinking, what would happen if we gave somebody a psychedelic, LSD at the time, and that would help people, or basically scare people away from alcohol? It would simulate a DT experience. And as a result, people would stop drinking and they would be terrified by the experience. So they gave people LSD and they weren't terrified at all. In fact, they loved it and had spiritual experiences, and they stopped drinking. So they noticed that they were successful in what they believed would happen, is stopping drinking. But the reason for doing that was absolutely and completely wrong. And so at the end of that 15-year period, they'd really taken a lot of different tangents and eventually concluded, if they're going to come up with one conclusion from that 15-year period, is that LSD is incredibly helpful in the treatment of alcoholism.
Perfect. And some of these they're still experimenting with and doing clinical trials with, are they not?
Yes. I mean, there's a psychedelic renaissance going on. So absolutely, yes. And there's a number of organizations that are really sort of taking on the addictions thing, which is wonderful. You know, it's fabulous to, I think, in order to offer an effective treatment for addictions generally, you need a lot of tools in your toolbox. And so we need the classics. We quite frankly need ibogaine. We need the classics being LSD and psilocybin. We need ibogaine, and we need Meai. So I hope that many of these medicines will be available in the addiction services toolbox in the not too distant future.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Meai. Could you give us a big history on this molecule?
Sure. So Meai was invented, and the inventor sort of noticed this anti-addictive quality of it. And then he wound up finding an individual who had an interest in it. And so this is before Clear Mind started. So this is pre-Clear Mind medicine. So this individual basically offered a party to her experience, to her community. And she did this many times. And so what she did is she said, come on over to my place, we're having a party. And then she would fill a table full of alcohol. There was beer, wine, and spirits. There was everything that anybody would ever want to drink. And she would fill another table full of food. And the deal was, if you came to her party, you would pre-dose with Meai, and then you'd fill out a questionnaire at the end. And then you do whatever you wanted to do. You could drink as much as you wanted to drink. And I asked her, how many of those people that came to your party over the period of time you would describe as having an addiction problem with alcohol and alcohol use disorder? And she said about half of the people really came for the booze and were intending to drink quite a bit. And almost everybody, when they were questioned at the end of leaving the experience, said that they drank way less than they anticipated drinking. It was substantial. It was almost all of the people who came. Now, completely by surprise, people were also asked about their eating. And most people said that they also ate a lot, a lot less. Now, curious enough, this particular woman became really interested in that, and she loved her father very dearly, and was very distressed by the fact her father was a chronic alcoholic and smoked packs of cigarettes every day. He no longer drinks, and he no longer smokes cigarettes, which personally I just find absolutely fascinating. I don't really understand why, but it seems to have this anti-addiction potential that is more than just alcohol, because intuitively it kind of makes sense for alcohol. You know, what I don't know, if I think about addictions and the range of addictions kind of being on a scale, there's the things you ingest, and then there's the things that you do. So for me, I can kind of intuitively understand it working for the things that you ingest. But will it work for things you do? I mean, if you're taking a shot of Meai when you're standing at a one-armed bandit plugging in quarters, I don't know if it works for gambling disorders or not. But I think it has significant potential, and more research is needed.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I guess those are things that they'll find out when they go through the clinical trials. So is there any, and I have a question for you about that in a bit, but is there any preclinical data that you have that you can share with us?
Yeah. So Clear Mind Medicine is basically a company that is going to legalize MEAI and make it available in a pill for addictions. So you have to do all of the regulatory steps. So that means safety in petri dishes, safety in rodents, safety in larger animals, safety in humans, and then stage 2 and 3 clinical trials where you demonstrate that it actually works. You say, does this work? And then you have to answer yes with a large enough population that it applies to everybody. So that's really the clinical trial pathway. And they've started that. And so they're demonstrating safety in rodents, quite frankly, right now. And so far, it's proven to be safe. So it's working. In fact, the window of safety, curiously enough, is similar to the window of psilocybin, which you know is a very, very safe molecule. So far, yes, they are pouring money into the clinical trial pathway as per regulatory agencies' requests. Mm-hmm. And so far, they're doing it mostly in the United States. So it's achieving FDA approval.
And you actually went into my next question. It was, how safe is MEAI compared to other molecules? So you mentioned psilocybin.
Yes. Yeah, so far the window of safety, so far from the initial research, they can conclude that the window of safety is a fairly big one, which is significant. A lot of drugs get legalized with much smaller windows of safety than we're initially seeing with the current preliminary evidence.
Mm-hmm. What other addictions could this potentially work for? I know you mentioned a few there already.
Yes. Well, that's really interesting because so far we, intuitively, it just feels, because it feels like alcohol, and it would kind of pull somebody who's using alcohol in because of the similarity of the experience. Alcohol is the complete bullseye. The fact that it was shown in this very small anecdotal, I don't even want to call it a study, but the very small anecdotal experiment to work with food means that's the second one up. But you can really think that it could work with anything that you ingest. Could it work with if you're smoking crack, which is ingesting crack, and you start, pairing it with that? Will you be finished with crack? I mean, maybe. There's no anecdotal evidence on that at all. But I'm just talking about my hunches. Is that the stuff that you ingest, it may work for. The behaviors, sexual addiction, gambling addiction. I don't know. I really don't know if it would work for that. I don't have a hunch with that, but it's interesting. I'm sure that as this thing unfolds, more and more addictions will be brought into this particular discussion.
Mm-hmm. And if we go back to alcohol use disorder specifically, there have been some alcohol substitutes proposed by other groups. How do these compare to MEAI?
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question because there's many groups out there, or a number, I won't say many, but there's a number of groups out there that realize that addictions treatment for alcoholism is desperately needed and doesn't work very well. So one of the other things that's being proposed is what would happen if we had another substitute for alcohol, because alcohol, as I say, is neurotoxic. It's quite frankly, it's a horrible drug. So what would happen if we had a drug that felt like alcohol but wasn't neurotoxic? And there's been a number of them proposed. One of them was a benzo-like substance. So, I used to work in a detox center. So benzodiazepines, Valium, Ativan, clorazepam, that whole classification of drugs, quite frankly, is obnoxious. It's a really, really tough drug, specifically to withdraw from. The level of agitation and emotional turbulence that happens when people are withdrawing from benzos is really, really hard. Even just for the detox workers to watch it, it's difficult. And for somebody to go through that level of emotional distress is really hard. So anything that is benzo-like, personally, I believe, would be a huge problem for people. So you're substituting a toxic problem, which is alcohol, for an addictive problem that's highly emotionally charged and quite frankly causes significant insomnia as you're withdrawing from it. So I think if it's a benzo-like product, I think it'll be a huge problem in people's lives, and it'll be changing one molecule or one substance, alcohol, for another one that's has a different set of problems.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I know you've briefly mentioned the clinical trial pathway already. And, sometimes for people who aren't involved in the process, of bringing a medicine to market, I was wondering if you could, just touch on that again and just let us know where Clearmind is in that process, because there are quite a few steps to the process.
You start with cells in a petri dish. And then you put the drug on the petri dish, and then, quite frankly, you see what level of the substance takes to kill the cells. That's the preliminary preclinical toxicology, is what it's called, preclinical toxicology. And then when it's proved to be safe in a petri dish at a certain level, what concentration takes to kill the cells is the question they ask. And then you move on to rodents, and then you start to give it to rodents at different concentrations, you see what happens, and then you dissect them and see what happened. And then you move into larger animals. And curiously enough, did you know that one of the animals that's closest to a human being is actually a pig? So they give it to pigs, and then they move into safety in humans, and then you give it to humans and you test everything you can possibly test and see what this is doing to them. And then, so then you've proven that it's safe. And then that's an FDA statement. The FDA have to plant the safe flag in the snowbank. And then you can move on to what's called efficacy. Does it actually work? And then you have to show that it works in a small population. And then you're testing your clinical trial. So it's more than just does it work, but does it work using this particular structure for this particular population? And then you move into a really big one. You've finalized, you've refined and polished your protocol is what you've done. And then you move into a really big study. And the big study is usually multi-site, often multi-country. You have to prove that it works with everybody. And so that when you prescribe it, it's effective for the human species generally, and it doesn't matter where they live. So that's the process. That's called a stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial and preclinical toxicology. And Clearmind is still in the preclinical toxicology phase, and they will hope to move. They hope to do. I'm just looking at my notes here. They hope to have the IND, the new drug study, the new drug FDA designation by the end of this year, and hope by the, I'm just looking at my notes here, hope that they would start their phase 1, which is safety in humans, by either the end of this year or the beginning of next year.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And I know one of the biggest questions that comes out of that from people that I hear is, how can I volunteer? How can I take part in the trials?
Well, it was interesting because when I ran MAPS Canada for all those years, I was constantly inundated by emails that pulled my heartstrings. People would often tell me their trauma history. And I just would sit there and my heart would open to these emails that people would send me. It was quite frankly, some of them were really difficult to even read. And they would say, I really want to participate in a clinical trial. So everybody got a personalized response. And then the hard truth that it's not the clinical research has to be available, geographically and where people are living, and it has to be available in a certain context that will eventually, that door will open, but it's quite limited, the number of people you can put through a clinical trial. And so just so people are welcome to send us an email. In fact, I think there is if you want to volunteer, question on the website, Clearmind Medicine's website. And so go in and follow those instructions. And if that isn't there, it will be soon. But be aware, not many people can, just based on geography and how the selection process works.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's definitely an interesting molecule. That is kind of getting close to the end of my questions here, and I think we might have some from the audience as well. But is there anything else that we should know about Meai?
Nah, let's just have a conversation.
Thanks, Mark and Shannon. I have a question. So the clinical trial pathway is long. Phase 1, phase 2, and you've got to go in vivo, you got to do animal models, and then you got to do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, then you got to go post-marketing. Do you anticipate, from what you know so far about the molecule, who may be excluded from use of this molecule? Because and I'll give you context for the reason I'm asking the question. As a medical doctor, very often the clinical trials that happen often exclude my patients because they have multiple issues. They might be diabetic, they might have hypertension, et cetera, and they can't even get into the studies. And so anything from I guess it would be mostly clinical, anecdotal, underground kind of information.
Yeah, I would break your question down into two questions. So the first question is, who would be excluded from the study? And then the second question is, who would it be inappropriate for after it's legalized? So in the study, whenever you're doing a research with any substance, especially something that has anything to do with a mental health disorder, you want people only with that mental health disorder. So in our case, we're talking about alcohol use disorder. That's the name of the mental health disorder. So you'd want to exclude anybody with other disorders, so that you know that it works with that one alone. So it's called exclusion criteria. So the exclusion criteria for the research, I'm guessing, I mean, I haven't got there yet, but the research that I've always been involved with excluded everybody with any other mental health diagnosis, because you really have to demonstrate it works with that particular issue. So that's the first question: is would people be excluded with other mental health diagnoses during the research? And the answer is yes. After it's legalized, I can't think of any exclusions. It's just, if you want to stop drinking, I can't, intuitively, this is my hunch. We have no evidence on this at all, so I'm just giving you my hunches, is that it would probably work for everybody. I don't think of any person who it wouldn't work for, is my hunch. Yeah.
And when you put that in context with a discussion you both had earlier around the harm to society and what, the experience of policing, yes, and alcohol, and Dr. David Nutt's 2010 publication on the dangers of these different drugs to society, yes, alcohol is right at the top. So yeah, you'd think almost anything less than that would be a benefit.
Yeah. I mean, it's also curious, I'm tangenting on what you said, is in the whole addictions world, we talk about harm reduction a lot. So harm reduction is the question: how do you continue using the drug but reduce the harm? So harm reduction for heroin is about needle exchange and safe injection sites and all of that. But harm reduction for alcohol is actually a tough one, because really the only discussion that people have when they're talking harm reduction for alcohol is non-potable alcohol drinkers who are drinking, hand sanitizer and Lysol and products like that. And then the harm reduction strategy is to give them real potable, drinkable alcohol. And so MEI is probably the only molecule I've ever heard of that is actually harm reduction for alcohol, because you could take it either by itself and have an alcohol-like experience at first, and then you would stop taking MEI, or you could add it to your alcohol and drink your vodka, but then you'd stop drinking vodka. So it's probably best described as true harm reduction.
There's a number of questions as well, but I want to ask one more thing, because often the seed of addiction is not the addiction is not the issue. The addiction is often the symptom. Yes. Do you think that there's going to be any component of MEI that gets to that seed of the addiction, whether it's the trauma, the attachment disorders, et cetera, or is it's going to end up more working on the symptom level?
Mostly the way that we're talking about is at symptom level. And yet, if you treat the symptoms, I mean, having worked in the addiction services, a lot of people can't get help and can't get counseling or therapy or whatever else they want to do because they're drinking so much. So this really helps deal with the whole drinking piece. And you're right. I mean, trauma, anybody that's ever listened to Gabor Mate will be convinced that trauma is the root of everything. But certainly it's the root of many addictions. So, if you want to work on your trauma history, it's very hard when you're intoxicated all the time. So this kind of deals with the intoxication piece and allows people to then work with something else. Hopefully, at the end of the day, addictions counselors will have lots of other tools in their bag. Things like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD therapy would also be available in addiction services. So once you get sober using something like MEI, then you become available to all of those other completely fabulous psychedelic treatments.
Yeah, great. And we need lots of tools in this toolbox, don't we? So let me read some of the questions from our attendees. I have a number of ketamine patients who have, as a byproduct of the treatment of their mood, lost their appetite for their chronic alcohol and cannabis use. Can you comment on the cannabis use disorder if aware of the literature?
Well, certainly working in the addiction services, we did have people showing up wanting to deal with cannabis use disorder. So, I have had those conversations with people with my counseling hat on. So I know they exist. And I'm also aware that cannabis use disorder is often associated with a complex constellation of other things that people come with, and you really quite quickly have to move into those other things. So, it's a complex disorder that has its roots in everything from trauma to, adverse incidents in childhood to everything else.
Wyatt asks, what are the determining factors around proper dosing?
That's a really interesting question, because we haven't got there yet. So to be completely honest, I have experienced it, and I have a sense of the dosing based on what I told you. What the woman who was inviting her neighbors over to a party, the amount that she gave them was way less than I would have considered to be effective. So we really haven't figured it out yet. So it may be much more effective. I talked about sort of the 4-dose strategy. She found it to be useful at a much significant reduced dose than I believed. So we don't know yet. We haven't got the dosing thing figured out at all yet. We're not there.
And that will be part of your clinical trial strategy as well. You'll have to do the dosing and the dosing intervals.
Now, it's interesting, just talking about dosing. So one individual who was a bold soul decided to push it. And he took 25 dosages all at once, which I can't even imagine. I mean, I can't, in my wildest fantasy, ever think about what that would be like. And so I talked to him about it, and I said, what was that like? And he said, well, I just wanted to lie down. So I chased him around that a little bit. Why? Why did you want to lie down? And the answer was, well, I wasn't necessarily really sedated. I could walk if I wanted to, but I just felt that I had achieved equilibrium, so there was nothing to do. So, life was completely in balance. So he wanted, he didn't have to lie down, but he wanted to lie down because there was nothing that he needed, because life was already right there. I find that just fascinating. So that tells me that it's not a powerful sedative, and it also tells me it's not a powerful stimulant. And and it wasn't disorienting. He knew who he was. It's not like a massive dose of, 25 doses of a psychedelic. You wouldn't even know who you are. So it was fascinating to think about what he did to himself and what his experience is. But I would never consider that myself. I think it'd be really, that's not me. I'm not that courageous.
Devin asks, has there been or are there plans for outreach to abstinence-based groups like AA, where it could be enormously beneficial, but possibly ignored based solely on it being a drug?
Oh, interesting question. So did you know that Bill W., who started AA, after he started AA and some time went on, had an LSD experience that he found to be absolutely fascinating. And he took it back to his community and advocated for the use of LSD within AA. I find that completely wild. And he wrote about it. He wrote letters on it. It's published in a book called Distilled Spirits by an author named Lattin, Lattin, if you're interested. So there is a connection between AA and psychedelics. It's also interesting that community did not accept it. They, in spite of the fact that he was one of the founders, they said absolutely not, because AA is fairly rigid in their thinking, and it's like a drug is a drug is a drug. So I would imagine that the actual organization itself would stick with their mantra, which is a drug is a drug, and we don't take any drugs at all. But I'd imagine some members within the AA community would use it as a way of helping them to stop drinking.
It is a very rigid thing. It's interesting because you think of how many people would be so well helped if not for that really strong bias. Wyatt asks, would MEAI be used only before drinking, or would it be taken continuously, assuming it's safe to do so?
You guys are bullseyes. That's a really interesting question. I don't know. So, intuitively, there's kind of 3 ways of thinking about it. And the answers to these questions have not yet been determined. So one way is just you add it to your alcohol when you want to drink the 26 ounces of vodka. That's one way. Another way is you take it without drinking alcohol. You really want to drink. You're completely, here I'm using a street term here, jonesing. You just really want the drug. Alcohol is drug. And so you take Meai instead of it and you don't drink. Or you just kind of have it in the background of your life, so you don't have the desire to do anything. So we don't know the answer to that question. But there are three sort of theoretical possibilities, and how it unfolds over time, we have yet to determine.
And Joe has a little bit, a long one here. If I'm not mistaken, it sounds like this molecule works the same way that some clinics are using ketamine IM infusion administration of the medicine without therapy. I hear that you envision a world where MEAI helps alcoholics get themselves in a state where they can do more classic psychedelic therapy. Does this molecule work as an enhancement for therapy without resorting to a modality involving MDMA or LSD?
Interesting question. So it's funny. I'm writing in another world. I'm writing a protocol for LSD actually, and I had to write a section on ketamine. And so I just did a deep dive into the ketamine literature, and ketamine has advantages. I mean, there is evidence that it works, but it also has some disadvantages, and the abuse potential of it is not insignificant. And so one of the questions that I would ask, that's kind of tangential to that question, is MEI abusable? Now, we don't actually fully know the answer, but I have an intuitive hunch that anything that has that abrupt end to it, where you just simply hit a wall of satiation, isn't abusable. I mean, I can't imagine how would you abuse something that you really have an urgent desire to stop using. So I think that's part of the answer. And part of the answer is, yes, I see that it's about stopping the addiction behavior and then becoming available to do the work that people need to do. And I could easily see, somebody using MEAI to stop drinking, or perhaps other addictions, and then sobering up and then saying, I need to work on myself. I got some issues that I really need to dive into. And then using what may wind up being the state-of-the-art treatments for trauma, which is things like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD and all the other classic and non-classic psychedelics as an addiction treatment.
See, Dr. Z comments here that it seems that the downstream metabolite of MEAI is a melatonin receptor agonist. That's why you want to lie down, perhaps?
I'm just going to go with yes on that one. Yeah.
All right. I have a kind of more like a big picture question. There's all sorts of chemists out there.
Yes.
Experimenting with molecules, methylating this, phosphorylating that, trying it on themselves, much in the the Shellgren lab scenario, and finding so many different results. This is only asking your opinion, but it's something I wonder, is why hasn't this been picked up more quickly by mainstream pharma? There's got to be some blockbuster molecules in here. Uh-oh.
Looks like he's frozen.
My question is shocked. Shocked and frozen Mark. Oh boy. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll get Mark back. Anyway, you want to take a stab at that, Shannon?
Well, you know what? I probably won't be able to answer that, but maybe I know Adi's joining us in the background here. She would probably know a little bit more than I would on that. I don't know if she wants to try that one.
Sure, it would be great, Pam, if you can repeat the question. Sorry.
Oh, I'm more interested in generally that there's been chemists all over the world that have had their own laboratories,
right.
Experimenting with all these molecules, adding this to this molecule, that to that molecule, all the classics, and that's that's where LSD came from. That's how we got MDMA, MDA, so many things. Just why haven't these been pharmaceutically used? I mean, many of these would be considered the potential for a blockbuster drug.
Right. I think there are some layers to the answer. for this question, because I think one thing is that it was, until recently, it was considered to be dangerous drugs. People, not only people will maybe avoid consuming them, but also physicians were not open to these options. Regulatory bodies were not open, and I think it took them some time to get some real concrete evidence showing that not only that those compounds can be safe, but they also can be efficacious. And I think that now that really, I see from our work, when we designing our clinical trial and when we have approached already to FDA, there's a much greater exception of this route, as long as you take the pharmaceutical, basic route, that you show that drug is safe, because for once you don't want to harm anyone before you can even start, doing something good for him. So many companies today takes this route. They want to show that drugs are safe and efficacious, and I'm just glad that we are living in an environment today that actually accept those treatments, and they see the great potential in them. But it's a great question. There are so many, molecules that were synthesized somewhere in the world that unfortunately will get to the garbage, if you will. But then I do hope that we will be able to make a dramatic change and really bring good product to the market that will really help people.
Thank you. Mark, you froze on us when I asked a question. I don't know if you heard it.
I think I did. And then sorry about that. Technology doesn't always work. I think part of the answer to the question as well is this wonderful thing in chemistry called the QSAR paradox, which is the quantitative structural relationship paradox, which basically says you cannot look at a molecule and predict what the impact will be on the human being. You cannot. And there's lots of examples of incredibly similar molecules that have dramatically different impacts on the human brain. And so they couldn't have predicted MEI from that group, the monoamine indane, the amino indanes. You couldn't have predicted that MEI would have this effect. So really what has to happen is very inventive chemists have to invent these things. And then the only thing to try it out on is a human. A rabbit will not tell you what the experience is. And so a human being has to try it. And the kind of unwritten rule in the underground chemistry world is that, or even the above ground chemistry world, as far as I know, is the person who invented the molecule has to try it out first. So they try it out in tiny amounts and then slowly over a period in time increase the amounts until they have a sense as to what it does. And MEI was a fascinating discovery, actually.
Well, a vet might argue that a rabbit can tell you what they feel. We just don't understand.
Yeah.
Just saying.
And anybody that has a dog in their life
little
will tell you.
Human-centric there, Mark.
Yes.
Little human-centric. More
Dogs tell us all the time, and cats tell us all the time what they feel. Yes, they do. I stand corrected.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I think the standard test in psychedelics in your animal models is actually the ear twitch test in rodents, right? So
yes,
I mean, what does that mean? The ear twitches, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah, you're right. It's very hard to predict what that means.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if that's a question. I don't see that. Well, I think this has been. I think this is an exciting time. I think people are opening up. I think the doors are opening up. I think the train has left the station. The research is happening. There's good clinical trials going to be coming out. I think there's a lot of jobs in the future here for researchers and scientists. So, get your degrees, get your master's, get your PhDs. There's a lot of great work here coming up, I think, for a lot of people. Exciting times, and hopefully a benefit to the citizens of this planet to be healthier, happier, more holistic humans. And, certainly MEAI has a lot of potential to be helping with especially with the drug that does cause so much damage historically and currently. Any last comments, Shannon or Mark, that you'd like to make or add?
I would like to appreciate, let's start with you, Pam. Thank you for your relentless ongoing leadership in the world of psychedelics. You work with the Canadian Psychedelic Society, which is an important organization because we need a Canadian organization that will do advocacy around this. This thing will not, the train will not move forward without important voices like yours. I'd like to thank Shannon. Shannon, I've known you for a long time, and I really, really appreciate you. Your warmth and graciousness is appreciated. And Diana, thank you for being part of the Canadian Psychedelic Association.
Thank you, Mark. You're very gracious. Thanks to both of you for being here. And I've gotten a lot of messages for people asking, knowing that their colleagues will want to watch this, asking when this will be posted. It takes about a week for us to get these ready. And our wonderful Deanna here at the CPA gets these all ready for us, and we'll have them posted so you can share with your colleagues, with your medical friends, everybody out there. This is exciting times and exciting time for science. And thank you both for also being leaders in this field. And another plug out to keep an eye out for Shannon and I. Is there going to be another World Psychedelic Day, I hope?
June 20 is the day, 6/20.
Do you want to give the website?
It's just worldpsychedelicsday.org.
Wonderful. Look forward to it. Thank you so much. Love it that we can do such a great webinar in under an hour. So everyone on the West Coast, get outside. Everyone on the East Coast, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pam.